These three crosses mark the site of a crime which tore a family apart and rocked a nation. It was Father's Day 2005. After dinner at KFC in Geelong, Robert Farquharson was driving his three sons back home to Winchelsea. Jai was 10, Tyler 7 and Bailey just 2. As the car came down this road, it drove into the dam, killing all three boys. The sole survivor was Robert Farquharson.
He made efforts to get all three children out of the car and he was unable to. He came back to the bank and waved down help and subsequently contacted emergency services.
Initially, it was thought to be an accident, but 3 months later, a more sinister explanation emerged.
Very special little boys.
Robert Farquharson was accused of deliberately driving the car into the dam.
These ordinary little boys in this ordinary town have made a huge difference on the lives of so many people.
He was convicted of murdering his children and has spent the last decade and a half in prison, sentenced to life behind bars. 7:30 can now reveal a fresh appeal is being prepared, with Robert Farquharson's supporters pointing to new evidence and a change in the law in 2019 as reasons to revisit the case.
Well, I think he's an innocent man.
I think the whole of the evidence, when you look at it, that's what it points to. I think it points to a tragic accident.
2 juries accepted that Farquharson drove his car into the dam as retribution after his marriage broke down and his wife moved on with another man.
The Crown case relied heavily on the evidence of Farquharson's friend, Greg King. 2 months before the children died, Mr King said Farquharson told him he wanted to pay his wife back big time by taking away the most important things to her.
The defence was critical of that evidence, saying the witness gave 3 different statements to police over as many months before arriving at the worst-case scenario.
The jury's found Robert guilty, but I can tell you he maintains his innocence of the charges. He will maintain his innocence in court during the plea. He'll be sentenced and he's given us instructions to appeal.
Farquharson successfully had his conviction overturned in 2009, but after being found guilty again, subsequent appeals failed. Throughout the protracted, nearly 8-year-long legal battle, Farquharson stuck to the same line. He says at the time he was suffering from a respiratory infection and had a coughing fit, passing out and crashing into the dam.
It was dark. He said he remembers started coughing, and the next thing he remembers is he was in the car and there was water around him. He said, I thought the car was stuck on a ledge. He opened the door, climbed out, and couldn't feel the bottom. He sank, and he struggled to get out of the dam without drowning himself. And it was pitch black. The water must have been 10 degrees, freezing.
Respiratory physician Dr. Chris Steinford treated Robert Farquharson before his first trial.
I said to him, what happened? And he basically said, well, I really don't know what happened.
Dr. Steinford is convinced Robert Farquharson had coughed to the point of passing out, a condition known as cough syncope. As an expert witness in the first and second trials, he continues to support Robert Farquharson to this day.
Cough syncope is 2 words, coughing because it's caused by a cough, but the syncope is sudden fainting, sudden loss of consciousness. Usually relatively brief, but at the time you're unconscious, you are totally unable to function. So that made me think there may well be something in this as the cause of the accident. And I wrote all that down in my medical record.
Is there a chance that he could be making up the symptoms?
I don't believe so. And the way he spoke to me, it came across as being genuine.
Dr Steinfort cites a similar case of Jeffrey Ferguson, who crashed his truck into a car, killing a man in rural Victoria in 2015.
And he happened to be talking on a hands-free mobile phone to his brother. And then suddenly he started to cough very violently. And his brother described a pause of around 4 or 5 seconds with no sound whatsoever. Then there was a deep breath in, an expletive, and then a crash.
Jeffrey Ferguson spent nearly 2 years in jail for culpable driving resulting in death. But his conviction was overturned after the Court of Appeal in 2020 accepted he may have been unconscious at the time of the crash. Chris Steinfort also gave expert evidence in his case. Why is talking about the case of Mr Ferguson important when thinking about Robert Farquharson?
There was an extra layer of verification in Mr Ferguson's case, in that he was talking hands-free to his brother, and his brother described what had happened. So obviously that didn't happen in Mr Farquharson's case.
Dr Steinfort says Farquharson suffered from another cough syncope episode between the first and second trial, which he says shows a history of the condition, and this is expected to form part of the argument for his fresh appeal.
He did have a further episode of cough syncope, alleged cough syncope, when he was in prison, and he told me about that. He was sitting on a chair in a workshop with a number of other prisoners, and he started to cough, and next minute he finds himself on the ground. His fellow prisoners were somewhat shocked. He didn't know what had happened, and it turned out that he fractured his ankle. And again, the same situation: coughing, sudden loss of consciousness, fairly rapid regaining of consciousness, and on this occasion he had an injury, and that was documented in the medical records at the prison.
I think he's innocent. I think that's what the evidence points to.
Chris Brook studied law and science in Melbourne and now works as an astrophysicist. After reading about Farquharson's case, he questioned the forensic science behind the conviction, publishing a book on the case in 2020.
So there was a lot of scorn put at him, saying, okay, this is what happened, this is the things that happened, and the police didn't believe him.
A key part of the case against Farquharson is that he escaped the car as it sank in the 7-metre deep dam and left the children to die. But Farquharson has always said he tried but wasn't able to get them out.
It just sank like a bomb, like 15, 20 seconds to sink once you get out of the car door. And whoever's in there is trapped. And it's not the first case where parents have been unable to get their children out of cars.
Brook points to recent research regarding the way cars sink, which he says supports Farquharson's story.
Some of these experiments that have been done on sinking cars, which really support his narrative, were done since the trial. So there's some published papers in scientific journals saying, this is what happens in a sinking car, this is your chances of getting out. So it goes through exactly his scenario, and the people that conducted these studies, they've even said, okay, his scenario makes sense.
For a person in Mr Farquharson's position who had lost his appeal to the Court of Appeal and had his application for special leave to the High Court refused, the only avenue which would have been left to him would be to approach the Attorney General with a petition for mercy.
4 years ago, the Victorian government brought in new laws to make it possible for a convicted person to seek a second or subsequent appeal if they met the threshold for fresh and compelling evidence. Criminal barrister Catherine Boston says since the laws were changed, only 3 cases have met that threshold and the convictions were overturned.
It's a very high bar. The Court of Appeal also has to be satisfied that a substantial miscarriage of justice has occurred.
Robert Farquharson's supporters point to last year's sensational finding in the case of Kathleen Folbig, as proof that the justice system sometimes gets it wrong. Once labelled the nation's worst female serial killer, Folbig had convictions for killing her 4 children quashed.
And I think it shows that these things happen and people have become aware that Lindy Chamberlain 40 years ago, right, these cases still happen today. The problems are still there.
But freedom for Farquharson will be a difficult proposition to sell. The mother of the children, Cindy Gambino Mulls, who initially thought he was innocent, went to her grave 2 years ago, believing her ex-husband had killed their children in an act of family violence.
What goes through a father's mind in the terms of, I have to kill my child to get to her? It doesn't have to be like that. It truly doesn't. My biggest thing is just get help. Don't think it's the end of the world. It's not the end of the world. The end of the world is when you kill your children.
Today, Dr. Steinfort says it still weighs on him that he wasn't able to convince the court that his patient was suffering from a medical episode, not murderous intent.
It's always somewhat distressing when you believe someone has had a miscarriage of justice and that I was somehow involved in that process. I guess there is a feeling of guilt. Perhaps I could have done better, but I think there's a job to be done.
What is that job?
To have him freed from prison and pardoned.
There's only one person who really knows what happened that night. Nearly 20 years later, the memorial marking the deaths of Jai, Tyler and Bailey has been there longer than they lived.